I was banned from Thanksgiving for standing up to my cousin. My aunt demanded an apology, but I refused, and then Thanksgiving has always been a big deal in my family. Every year, about 35 of us would cram into my aunt and uncle's home in the suburbs of Denver. The place would be alive with the sound of kids playing tag, adults chatting over cocktails, and the unmistakable aroma of turkey and stuffing wafting through the air. It was chaotic, sure, but in a comforting way. For me, it was one of the few times I got to see everyone in one place, catch up on life, and share in the kind of warmth that only family gatherings can bring. Or at least, that's how it used to feel. This year was different. The tension started long before Thanksgiving Day. Sarah, my cousin, and I had been on shaky ground for over a year. It all stemmed from a messy inheritance dispute after my grandfather passed. Without getting into all the details, Sarah and her mother, my Aunt Linda, felt slighted by how the will was divided. They seemed to think I had somehow schemed my way into getting more than my share, even though I had nothing to do with the decisions. Ever since, Sarah had been treating me like I was the enemy. As I pulled into the driveway of Scott and Linda's house, I felt a knot in my stomach. Normally, I'd be excited to dive into the feast and hear everyone's stories from the past year. This time, I knew there'd be an elephant in the room, and its name was Sarah. Stepping inside, I was immediately greeted by my Uncle Scott. He clapped me on the back and gave me a warm welcome, as if nothing was amiss. Linda, on the other hand, gave me a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her usual exuberance was replaced with something more measured, almost cautious. I made my way through the house, exchanging pleasantries with relatives. My parents, Ruth and Daniel, were already there, holding court in the living room. They had been my rock through this whole ordeal, always reminding me to keep my head high no matter what Sarah said. As I joined them, my mom whispered, "Just stay calm. Don't let her get to you." I nodded, grateful for the reminder, but already bracing for what was to come. Dinner was served buffet style, as usual, with everyone piling their plates high before squeezing around the long, mismatched tables that had been shoved together to accommodate us all. I ended up sitting a few seats down from Sarah, who was flanked by her husband, Jason, and her mom. At first, everything seemed fine. The conversation was light, filled with the typical updates about work, kids, and travel plans. But then, as the wine flowed and the main course was devoured, Sarah decided to make her move. "So, Max," she said, her voice loud enough to cut through the chatter, "how's life been treating you? Still riding high on that inheritance?" The table went quiet. All eyes turned to me. My fork hovered in midair as I tried to decide how to respond. I could feel my mom tense beside me, her hand gripping her glass just a little too tightly. "Life's been good," I said evenly, refusing to take the bait. "Busy with work. You know how it is." Sarah gave a little laugh, the kind that was more condescending than genuine. "Must be nice to have everything handed to you." Sarah, her dad, Scott, interjected, his tone warning. Not the time, but Sarah wasn't about to be stopped. "I'm just saying, some of us have had to work a little harder, that's all." It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My mom started to say something, but I touched her arm lightly to stop her. "I think we all work hard in our own ways, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Let's just enjoy dinner, yeah?" Her face reddened slightly, but she didn't push further, at least not out loud. Instead, she turned to her mom and muttered something under her breath. I couldn't catch all of it, but I distinctly heard the words ungrateful and selfish. My appetite vanished. I forced myself to stay seated, focusing on my dad's quiet conversation with my cousin Megan about her recent move to Seattle. But the damage had been done. The warmth that usually filled these gatherings was replaced by a palpable chill. After dinner, the family began to spread out, some heading to the living room for coffee and dessert while others stayed in the kitchen to help clean up. I found myself alone for a moment in the backyard, nursing a cup of cider and staring at the darkening sky. My mind raced with frustration and sadness. This wasn't how Thanksgiving was supposed to feel. I heard the door creak open behind me and turned to see my mom stepping out. "You okay?" she asked gently. "Yeah," I lied. "Just needed some air." She sighed and came to stand beside me. "I know this isn't easy, but remember, Sarah's bitterness isn't your fault. You've done nothing wrong. I know, I said, but it doesn't make it any less exhausting. Before she could respond, the door opened again, and Scott stepped out. Hey, Max, he said hesitantly. Sorry about what happened at the table. I tried to shut it down. It's fine, I said, even though it wasn't. I know she's been holding on to a lot of resentment. Scott nodded, looking weary. She's been difficult lately. Linda's trying to keep the peace, but it's been hard. I just wanted you to know, not everyone's against you. Thanks, Scott, I said sincerely. That means a lot. As the evening wound down, I made my rounds to say goodbye, avoiding Sarah altogether. Driving home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Thanksgiving used to be my favorite time of year, but now it felt like the start of a war I didn't want to fight. Months passed after that awkward Thanksgiving dinner, and while I did my best to move on, Sarah clearly had other plans. At first, it was just the occasional passive-aggressive comment in the family group chat. Nothing too overt, but enough to remind me that she hadn't let go of her grudge. I ignored it, hoping she'd get bored and move on. I should have known better. One Saturday morning in late spring, my phone buzzed. Seeing Sarah's name on the screen was a surprise. We didn't exactly talk one-on-one unless it was absolutely necessary. Against my better judgment, I answered. Hi, Sarah. What's up? She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Max, I need a favor. Her tone was clipped, businesslike, and already I could feel my stomach tightening. What kind of favor? I asked cautiously. I've hit a rough patch, she said, her voice softening slightly, as if she were trying to sound vulnerable. Credit card debt's piling up, and I need help getting back on my feet. I'm asking as family. I blinked, caught off guard. How much are we talking about? 15,000. It was such a big number that I actually laughed, thinking she was joking. But when I heard nothing but silence on the other end, I realized she was serious. Sarah, that's a lot of money. I know, she said quickly, but I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't serious. You've always been in a better financial position than me, Max. You can afford it. Her words hit a nerve. It wasn't the first time she'd implied that I had life easier than she did. I can't just hand over $15,000, I said. I've got my own expenses, my own goals. I'm sorry, but I can't help you with this. The silence on the line was deafening. When she finally spoke again, her voice was sharp. You can't, or you won't? Sarah? No, I get it, she interrupted. It's fine. You're selfish, just like always. I should have known better than to think you'd actually care about anyone but yourself. Before I could respond, she hung up. I stared at my phone, still processing what had just happened. The conversation felt surreal, like some bizarre test I hadn't known I was taking. Over the next few weeks, the fallout became clear. It started with subtle digs in the group chat, vague statements about how some people don't value family or how loyalty seems to be a dying trait. She didn't mention me by name, but the implication was obvious. Then came the whispers. Relatives began calling my mom, asking if it was true that I had refused to help Sarah in her time of need. Sarah, it seemed, had been busy spinning her own version of events, framing me as the cold-hearted villain who turned my back on her. My mom defended me fiercely, but the damage was done. A rift was forming, and Sarah was pouring gasoline on the fire. It wasn't long before Aunt Linda got involved. She called me one evening, her tone as smooth and measured as always. Max, I'm not calling to pick a fight, she said, which was exactly what someone says when they're about to pick a fight. I just think it's important to consider how much this is hurting Sarah. She feels betrayed. Linda, I understand that she's upset, I said, keeping my voice as even as possible. But I'm not in a position to give her that kind of money. Are you really not, Max? Or is this about proving a point? I clenched my jaw. It's not about proving a point. It's about setting boundaries. She sighed heavily, as if I'd just confessed to a heinous crime. Family is supposed to help each other. That's how we've always operated. Don't you think an apology might smooth things over? An apology? I repeated, incredulous. For what? For not giving her $15,000. For making her feel like she doesn't matter, Linda replied sharply. Sometimes it's not about the money, Max. It's about the gesture. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. With all due respect, Linda, this isn't about gestures. This is about Sarah's choices, not mine. I'm not going to apologize for something that isn't my fault. She sighed again, deeper this time, and I could tell she was done pretending to be diplomatic. Well, I hope you're happy with the consequences of your stubbornness. When the call ended, I sat there, seething. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to do anything to release the frustration building inside me. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water and took a long drink, trying to calm down. The next escalation came in the form of the group chat. Sarah, emboldened by Linda's support, started posting more frequently, her messages dripping with passive aggression. It's amazing how some people think they're too good to help family, one read. Another simply said, actions speak louder than words. Funny how silence says so much. A few relatives chimed in with vague comments that could have been interpreted as support for either side. Others stayed conspicuously silent, unwilling to pick a side publicly. I didn't respond to any of it, determined not to give Sarah the satisfaction of engaging. But then she took it a step further. One morning, I woke up to a text from Sarah, a single accusatory sentence that sent my blood boiling. "You've ruined Thanksgiving for me." According to her, my refusal to help her was tearing the family apart. She claimed she couldn't even look forward to the holiday because of the drama I'd caused. It was manipulative, plain, and simple. A calculated attempt to guilt me into caving. But I wasn't about to play her game. By now, the family was split down the middle. Some believed Sarah's version of events, seeing me as the selfish bad guy who refused to help his cousin in need. Others quietly supported me, though most were hesitant to speak up and risk Sarah's wrath. It was exhausting, like being caught in a storm with no end in sight. I confided in my parents about everything, and their anger mirrored my own. "You've done nothing wrong," my mom insisted. "If Sarah wants to make this into a war, that's on her, not you." My dad, ever the pragmatist, added, "You can't control how people react. All you can do is stand by your decisions." It was good advice, but it didn't make the situation any easier to endure. I knew Sarah wasn't going to let this go quietly. The storm she'd started was only just beginning. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around again, the family had become a battlefield, with alliances and grudges forming in every direction. The tension reached a boiling point a week before the holiday when Scott and Linda, the usual hosts, called me with what they probably thought was a diplomatic solution. "Max," Scott began, his voice strained, "we've been thinking about how to handle Thanksgiving this year. We really want it to be a peaceful gathering." "Okay," I said cautiously. "What does that have to do with me?" Linda jumped in, her tone softer but no less pointed. "We think it might be best if you apologize to Sarah before the holiday. It would mean so much to everyone if we could all come together without any lingering animosity." My grip on the phone tightened. "You're saying I should apologize to Sarah? For what?" Scott hesitated. "Not necessarily for anything specific. Just, to smooth things over. To keep the peace," Linda added. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So, let me get this straight. Sarah has been dragging my name through the mud for months, posting cryptic messages, and telling everyone I'm selfish. But I'm the one who has to apologize." "It's not about blame," Linda insisted. "It's about moving forward." I let out a bitter laugh. "Right. Moving forward by pretending I did something wrong when I didn't. Thanks, but no thanks." Scott sighed heavily. "We don't want negative energy at Thanksgiving, Max. If you can't find it in your heart to make peace, maybe it's better if you don't come this year." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You're uninviting me? Because I won't apologize for something I didn't do?" "It's not about picking sides," Linda said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's about protecting the family dynamic." I hung up shortly after that, too angry and hurt to continue the conversation. When I told my parents what had happened, they were furious. My mom immediately called Linda to give her a piece of her mind, but it was clear the decision had been made. Thanksgiving would go on without me. The day itself was surreal. Normally, I'd be helping with last-minute preparations or cracking jokes with my cousins by now. Instead, I spent the morning at home with my parents. My mom tried to keep things light, making pancakes and putting on old family movies, but the weight of what was happening hung in the air like a storm cloud. Meanwhile, at Scott and Linda's house, things were unraveling faster than anyone expected. I got the details later from my cousin Megan, who called me that evening, unable to wait to spill the tea. "Max, you would not believe what happened," she began, her voice a mix of disbelief and amusement. "It was a disaster." Apparently, Sarah had decided Thanksgiving was the perfect time to air her grievances. Right after everyone sat down to eat, she launched into a dramatic speech about loyalty and family values. She didn't mention me by name, but it was clear who she was talking about. She was tearing up Max, Megan said, going on and on about how hurt she was and how hard it was to come to Thanksgiving knowing certain people didn't care about her feelings. It was so over the top. Uncle Scott, usually the family peacemaker, finally lost his patience. He interrupted Sarah mid-speech, saying something like, "Enough already. This isn't the time or place for this." That opened the floodgates. Sarah snapped back, accusing Scott of not supporting her and saying he didn't understand how much pain I had caused her. From there, other family members began chiming in. Some defended Sarah, saying family should help each other no matter what. Others, including Megan, sided with Scott, calling Sarah out for turning the gathering into a personal pity party. "It was chaos," Megan said, her voice rising with excitement. People were yelling across the table. Aunt Linda was crying. Even Jason tried to get Sarah to calm down, but she wouldn't listen. She stormed out of the room and slammed the door. I couldn't help but laugh, even as a pang of sadness hit me. "Sounds like a great holiday." "It was a train wreck," Megan agreed. "Honestly, you didn't miss much." Later that night, my mom got her own update from Linda, who was in tears, blaming me for the disaster. According to Linda, if I had just apologized to Sarah, none of this would have happened. My mom, bless her, wasn't having any of it. She told Linda that Sarah's behavior was the real problem and that it was time for her to stop enabling her daughter's manipulative tendencies. The conversation ended on a sour note, and now Linda wasn't speaking to my mom either. As if that wasn't enough, the family group chat exploded the next day. Sarah posted a long, emotional message about how she felt excluded and betrayed by the people she thought she could count on. A few relatives chimed in with messages of support, while others, clearly fed up, told her to stop airing her grievances publicly. One message in particular stood out. It was from Uncle Brian, who rarely got involved in family drama. "This isn't about Max," he wrote. "It's about Sarah not getting what she wants and throwing a tantrum about it. Enough is enough." The chat went silent after that. It was as if Brian's message had punctured the balloon of chaos, leaving everyone too stunned to respond. By the end of the week, it was clear the family was more divided than ever. Some relatives stopped responding to messages altogether, while others began reaching out to me privately to share their thoughts. A few even apologized for taking Sarah's side initially, admitting they hadn't realized how manipulative she had been. Still, the damage was done. The family, once a close-knit group, now felt fractured beyond repair. And while part of me was relieved to see the truth about Sarah coming to light, another part of me mourned what we had lost. Thanksgiving used to be my favorite holiday. Now, it was just a reminder of how easily things can fall apart. In the weeks following Thanksgiving, the family drama continued to unfold like a slow-motion car crash. Every time I thought it had reached its peak, Sarah found a way to escalate things further. The group chat became a battleground, with messages flying back and forth faster than I could keep up. Relatives who usually stayed out of the drama were now picking sides, and the tension was thicker than ever. One evening, I got a call from my cousin Henry, who had been keeping a low profile throughout the whole ordeal. Henry wasn't the type to get involved in family feuds. He preferred to observe from the sidelines. That's why his call caught me off guard. "Max," he said after a brief hello, "I think you need to hear this. What's going on?" I asked, already bracing myself. "Sarah's been asking for money from other family members too," he said. "Not just small loans either. Big amounts. And she's been doing it for years." I sat up straighter. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Henry replied. "She came to me a while back, asking for $5,000 to cover some unexpected expenses, She promised to pay it back in a month. I gave it to her, but I never saw a dime. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Why didn't you say anything? I didn't want to stir the pot, he admitted. But now, with everything going on, I feel like I have to. She's been playing the victim, but she's the one taking advantage of everyone. Henry wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, more family members started coming forward, sharing similar stories. Sarah had been borrowing money from relatives left and right, always with a heartfelt plea and a promise to pay it back quickly. None of them had seen their money again. As these revelations came to light, the tide began to turn. Even some of Sarah's staunchest supporters started to question her motives. Aunt Linda, who had been her biggest advocate, was visibly shaken. At a family dinner, one I wasn't invited to, of course, Linda was confronted by several relatives who demanded to know if she had been aware of Sarah's behavior. According to Megan, who filled me in later, Linda looked humiliated and had very little to say in her daughter's defense. Meanwhile, Sarah's fiancé Jason was growing distant. Megan mentioned that he had stopped defending Sarah during family arguments and had even skipped a dinner where they were both expected to attend. The whispers started almost immediately. Was their relationship on the rocks? Would the wedding still happen? No one knew for sure, but it was clear that the strain of Sarah's antics was taking its toll. Around this time, I received an unexpected message from Aunt Linda. She apologized, not a half-hearted, "I'm sorry you feel that way" kind of apology, but a genuine one. She admitted that she had been enabling Sarah for years, shielding her from the consequences of her actions and giving her whatever she wanted. "I should have seen this coming," Linda wrote. "I thought I was protecting her, but I was just making things worse." It was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, I appreciated her honesty. On the other, it was hard to ignore how much damage had already been done. The family group chat, once a chaotic mess of arguments and accusations, began to quiet down as people distanced themselves from Sarah. Some relatives even left the chat altogether, tired of the constant drama. A few of us started a new, smaller chat to escape the toxicity. It felt like a fresh start, even if it came at the cost of losing connections with some family members. But Sarah wasn't ready to let go. She continued to post vague, self-pitying messages on social media, talking about betrayal and how some people didn't understand the meaning of family. At first, a handful of relatives liked her posts, but as the truth about her behavior spread, even that support began to dwindle. Then came the biggest shock of all. Jason broke off their engagement. I heard about it through the grapevine. Sarah hadn't made any public announcements, but Megan confirmed it during one of our phone calls. Jason told one of the cousins that he couldn't handle the drama anymore, Megan said. He said Sarah's manipulative tendencies were becoming too much for him. Honestly, I'm surprised it lasted as long as it did. The news spread quickly, and the family's focus shifted from me to Sarah. Relatives who had once been divided over our feud were now bonding over their shared frustrations with her. Stories of her entitlement and manipulative behavior became the main topic of conversation at family gatherings. At one point, a distant cousin who rarely got involved in family matters decided to speak up. She shared a long message in the group chat, detailing her own experiences with Sarah and calling her out for playing the victim. The message was a turning point. For the first time, it felt like the family was united in their frustration with Sarah. As the weeks went by, Sarah's circle of supporters grew smaller and smaller. Relatives who had once defended her were now distancing themselves, some even reaching out to apologize to me for believing her version of events. It was vindicating, but also deeply sad. The family felt fractured in a way that might never fully heal. The fallout wasn't limited to just Sarah. Linda, who had spent so long defending her daughter, found herself increasingly isolated. At one family gathering, she tearfully admitted to my mom that she regretted enabling Sarah for so many years. It was a moment of vulnerability that my mom later described as bittersweet, an acknowledgement of the past, but one that came far too late. Through it all, I kept my distance. I had no interest in engaging with Sarah or trying to fix the mess she had created. Instead, I focused on the relationships that mattered, the relatives who had supported me and stood by my side throughout the ordeal. By the time Christmas rolled around, the family dynamic had shifted completely. Sarah was no longer the center of attention, and I was finally able to enjoy the holidays without the weight of her drama hanging over my head. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. A year after the Thanksgiving debacle, the family was still feeling the aftershocks of Sarah's actions. Relationships had shifted, alliances had formed and dissolved, and the group dynamic was forever changed. For me, it was a time of reflection, trying to piece together what family meant when trust had been so thoroughly fractured. The most surprising development came out of nowhere, in the form of an invitation from Aunt Linda. It was a card with her familiar loopy handwriting, inviting me to a small family dinner at her house. The note inside was apologetic, almost desperate. She admitted she had made mistakes in how she handled the situation with Sarah and asked for a chance to start fresh. The phrase, "one more chance to fix things," stuck out like a sore thumb. I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to ignore it altogether. Another part of me, the one that still missed how things used to be, was tempted to go. I talked it over with my parents, who urged me to approach it cautiously. My mom warned me to keep my expectations low, while my dad emphasized the importance of protecting my boundaries. After some back and forth, I decided to attend, but only after confirming with Linda that Sarah wouldn't be there. "Sarah won't be attending," Linda assured me over the phone. "She's not ready to face everyone yet. This is about healing, Max. No drama." That last part felt overly optimistic, but I agreed to go. The dinner itself was small and subdued, a far cry from the sprawling family feasts of the past. Only a handful of relatives were there, mostly those who had supported me or stayed neutral throughout the feud. I was greeted warmly, though there was an undercurrent of tension, like everyone was waiting to see how I'd react. As we sat down to eat, several family members approached me privately to apologize. A cousin admitted they had initially believed Sarah's version of events, but realized too late how manipulative she had been. Another confessed they had felt pressured to side with her because of her emotional outbursts. It was cathartic to hear these admissions, but they also served as a reminder of just how deeply Sarah's actions had affected us all. Midway through the dinner, Linda pulled me aside. Her voice was trembling, and for the first time in years, she looked vulnerable. "Max, I need to say this," she began. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, and I realize now how much I contributed to it. I've spent Sarah's whole life shielding her from consequences, giving her whatever she wanted, and excusing her behavior. I thought I was helping her, but I was just making things worse. I didn't know how to respond at first. Part of me wanted to let her off the hook. After all, her regret seemed genuine. But another part of me was still angry, still hurt. "I appreciate you saying that," I finally said, "but it doesn't erase what's happened. The damage is already done." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know. I just hope someday we can all move past it." When we returned to the table, the atmosphere felt lighter, as if her confession had lifted some of the weight hanging over the room. A distant cousin who had stayed neutral throughout the feud spoke up, sharing some new details about Sarah. Apparently, she had lost her job and was dealing with the fallout of her broken engagement. The cousin didn't go into much detail but hinted that Sarah was struggling to stay afloat. Despite her absence, Sarah still managed to cast a shadow over the evening. Midway through dinner, a string of messages from her popped up in the family group chat. She accused me of turning the family against her, claiming I had stolen her relationships. Most of the relatives ignored the messages, but they lingered in the background like a bad smell. Toward the end of the night, Linda made a bold suggestion. "Maybe it's time for you and Sarah to sit down privately and talk things through," she said. I didn't even hesitate. "That's not going to happen," I said firmly. "I'm not interested in rehashing this unless she's ready to take accountability." And from the looks of her messages, she's nowhere close to that. Linda seemed disappointed, but she didn't push the issue further. As the dinner wrapped up, I felt a surprising sense of closure. For the first time in a long time, it seemed like the family was beginning to move forward, even if it meant leaving certain people behind. Several relatives decided to leave the old group chat entirely, starting a new one for those who wanted to focus on rebuilding relationships without the constant drama. It was a small step, but it felt significant. A few days later, Sarah sent me a long, rambling email. It was filled with accusations, blaming me for everything from her failed engagement to her financial struggles. She framed herself as the victim, twisting the narrative to paint me as the villain. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked her on every platform and encouraged my parents to do the same. There was no point in keeping the door open to more manipulation. That Thanksgiving, my parents hosted a smaller, more intimate gathering. We only invited relatives who had supported us throughout the ordeal. Without the usual tension in the air, it felt like a return to the holidays I had always loved, full of warmth, laughter, and genuine connection. We even started a new tradition. After dinner, we watched movies and shared stories from years past. It was simple but perfect. Looking back, this whole ordeal taught me a lot about boundaries and self-respect. Standing up for myself wasn't easy, especially when it meant going against family expectations. But it was necessary. Sometimes, protecting your peace means letting go of people who refuse to change, no matter how much you wish things could be different. Months later, I heard through the grapevine that Sarah had started therapy. She was trying to rebuild her life, though the details were vague. I don't wish her any harm, but reconciliation isn't something I'm interested in. I've made my peace with the situation, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can move forward without looking back. This year's holidays were peaceful, drama-free, and everything they should be. And that's something I'll never take for granted again. I was the family's fixer until I said no. Then they hijacked my birthday party. What happened next will shock you and then... Hi, my name is Ryan, and I'm 32 years old. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I work as a web developer. If I had to describe my role in my family, I'd say I'm the one who keeps the machine running. Not emotionally. My mom, Diane, takes care of that. Not socially either. My dad, Robert, has always been good at keeping up appearances. No, I'm the guy everyone calls when something goes wrong. Arguments? I mediate. Errands? I run them. Financial trouble? I pitch in. You'd think all this would make me the favorite, but in my family, it's never that simple. I'm the middle child. Mark, my older brother, is 37, married to his college sweetheart, and the textbook definition of the golden child. He's a corporate lawyer with an impeccable track record. My parents love to gush about him, and why wouldn't they? He's successful, respected, and always polished. Then there's Sophie, my 28-year-old younger sister. She's the baby of the family and the rebellious one. She's impulsive and carefree, often leaving chaos in her wake. Somehow, this only adds to her charm in my parents' eyes. They call her free-spirited or say she's just finding her way. Meanwhile, I'm the one they don't worry about, the one they count on to keep everything together. I was the dependable kid. I got good grades, stayed out of trouble, and started working part-time as soon as I could. My parents didn't need to nag me or check up on me like they did with Mark and Sophie. I was the steady one, the kid who just got on with it. I think they appreciated that, but it also meant they didn't really notice me. Mark was always in the spotlight for his achievements. He graduated top of his class, landed a high-paying job, and bought a house before he turned 30. My parents couldn't stop bragging about him. Sophie, on the other hand, got attention for her dramatic adventures, like dyeing her hair electric blue in high school or moving to Chicago with no plan and no job prospects. My parents would shake their heads, exasperated, but then turn around and praise her for being bold and adventurous. Me? I stayed in the background, doing what needed to be done. At first, I didn't mind. It felt good to be dependable, to know that my family could count on me. But as the years went by, I realized that being dependable also meant being taken for granted. If there was a fight between Mark and Sophie, I was the one who had to step in and play referee. When Sophie needed help moving apartments, again, it was me loading boxes into my car. When my parents ran into unexpected expenses, I was the one who quietly covered the difference. And yet, despite everything I did, it never felt like I was truly seen or appreciated. For years, I told myself this was just how families worked. Mark was too busy with his high-powered job, and Sophie was still figuring things out, so it made sense for me to step up. Family is family, right? But lately, I've started to question that. It began a few weeks ago when Sophie called me in tears. She just lost her part-time job and couldn't pay her rent. She was panicking about being evicted. I felt bad for her. I really did. But this wasn't the first time. Sophie had a habit of getting herself into messes and then leaning on everyone else to bail her out. My parents, of course, rushed to comfort her. "She's just going through a rough patch," they said. "She'll figure it out." They helped as much as they could, but when their wallets ran dry, they turned to me. This time, though, I said no. I was polite but firm. I told Sophie I couldn't help her financially, but offered to help her look for a new job or find a cheaper apartment. She didn't take it well. "Wow, Ryan," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I guess it's nice to know where I stand with you." She hung up before I could respond. The next day, my mom called. "Ryan, honey, I know Sophie called you about her rent," she began, her tone already edging toward guilt. "She's really struggling. Mark can't help right now, and I thought maybe you could pitch in, just this once." "Mom," I said, trying to stay calm, "I've helped Sophie a lot over the years. She needs to learn to handle things on her own." There was a long pause before she sighed. "I understand that," she said finally, "but you know how she is. She's your sister, Ryan. Family is supposed to support each other." That phrase, "family is supposed to support each other," has been thrown at me more times than I can count, and every time, it seems to mean the same thing. Ryan is supposed to support everyone else. I wanted to argue, to explain how tired I was of always being the one who stepped up, but I knew it wouldn't get me anywhere. So, I said, "I'm sorry, Mom, but I can't help this time." The disappointment in her voice was hard to miss. "All right," she said quietly. "I just thought you'd want to help. I guess I was wrong." The tension in the family has been palpable ever since. Sophie hasn't returned my calls, and my conversations with my parents have been strained at best. I know they think I'm being selfish, but for the first time in my life, I don't regret saying no. It's strange. I've spent years being the glue that holds my family together, and now I'm starting to wonder what happens when I stop. Will they fall apart without me? Or will they finally start to see me not just as the fixer, but as a person with limits, too? Only time will tell. When my mom called me a week before my 32nd birthday, I was caught off guard. She sounded unusually cheerful. "Hi, Ryan," she said, her voice practically sing-song. "How are you doing, honey?" "I'm good," I replied, cautious. "What's up?" "Well," she started, dragging out the word like she was about to reveal something big. "Your birthday's coming up, and we've got a little surprise planned for you. Don't make any plans, okay?" That stopped me in my tracks. My family planning something for me? That was new. My birthdays were usually a quiet affair. A cake, a few cards, maybe dinner at my parents' house if they weren't busy. Compared to the lavish dinners and parties Mark got, or the over-the-top celebrations Sophie had, mine were always understated. I never expected much, so I usually just planned something small for myself. "A surprise?" I said, trying not to sound too skeptical. "Yes," she said enthusiastically. "It's going to be special this year. Just wait and see." I hung up the phone feeling a mix of emotions. Part of me was touched. Maybe this was their way of showing they appreciated everything I've done for them. Maybe, for once, they'd noticed how much I've sacrificed over the years. Another part of me was cautious. My family didn't have the best track record of making me feel like a priority, and I didn't want to get my hopes up. Over the next week, I tried to keep my expectations low, but I couldn't help imagining what they might be planning. A dinner? A small party? Something as simple as a heartfelt speech? The idea of being celebrated for a change was exciting, and I started to feel hopeful. The day of my birthday arrived, and I made sure to keep my schedule clear, just like my mom had asked. I even dressed up a little, nothing fancy, just a nice shirt and jeans. When I pulled up to my parents' house that evening, I noticed a few extra cars in the driveway. My heart lifted. It looked like they'd gone all out. As soon as I walked through the front door, a loud chorus of surprise greeted me. The living room was packed with people. Family friends, even a few old coworkers I hadn't seen in years. There were streamers taped haphazardly to the walls, balloons floating in the corners, and a table covered with snacks and a store-bought cake. It wasn't Pinterest-worthy, but it was clear they'd put effort into it, and I couldn't help but smile. "Happy birthday, Ryan," my mom said, rushing over to hug me. "Were you surprised?" "Yeah," I said, genuinely smiling. I definitely didn't see this coming. For the first hour, I mingled with the guests, catching up with old friends and enjoying the attention. It felt nice to be at the center of things for once. Mark and his wife, Rachel, were there, as polished and charming as ever. Sophie and her fiancé, Liam, showed up late but gave me a quick hug before disappearing into the crowd. For the first time in a long time, it felt like I was being celebrated. But then things started to shift. About halfway through the evening, my mom clapped her hands to get everyone's attention. "Okay, everyone," she said, her voice bright and commanding. "If I could have a moment, I just want to say a few words about our wonderful Ryan." I froze, not used to being the subject of any speech. Maybe this was it, the moment I'd been hoping for. "First of all, we're so proud of Ryan for everything he's accomplished," she said, smiling warmly at me. "But while we're all here together, I also want to share some exciting news about the family." I blinked, my smile faltering. Exciting news? What did that have to do with my birthday? She turned to Mark, who was standing near the fireplace with Rachel. "Mark recently got a big promotion at work," my mom announced, beaming. "He's now the head of his department." The room erupted into applause. My mom rushed over to hug Mark, her voice full of pride. "We're so proud of you, Mark," she said. "You've worked so hard for this." "Thanks, Mom," Mark said modestly, as if this was no big deal. I clapped along with everyone else, but the knot in my stomach was hard to ignore. This was supposed to be my day, yet somehow, Mark's promotion had become the highlight of the evening. "And that's not all," my mom said, her voice rising with excitement. "We have even more wonderful news to share." She turned to Sophie, who was perched on the couch with Liam. "Sophie and Liam are engaged," she exclaimed. The room gasped in delight, followed by more applause. My parents practically tripped over themselves to congratulate Sophie and Liam. My dad even raised his glass for a toast. "To Sophie and Liam," he said. "We couldn't be happier for you both." Sophie held up her hand to show off her ring, a small but elegant diamond. Everyone oohed and awed over it, and Liam wrapped an arm around her, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. Meanwhile, I stood there, frozen, holding an empty cup in my hand. My birthday had officially been hijacked. What was supposed to be my celebration had turned into a showcase for Mark's career and Sophie's engagement. I plastered a smile on my face, trying not to let my frustration show, but inside, I was fuming. As if that weren't enough, my mom walked over to me with an envelope in her hand. "Ryan," she said, smiling warmly, "we've got something for you, too." I perked up slightly, hopeful that maybe this was finally my moment. I opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten note. My heart sank as I read the words inside. "As part of your birthday gift," my dad said, his tone proud, "we thought you might like to help Sophie with her wedding planning. You're so talented with design, so we figured you could create the invitations and coordinate with the vendors. And if you could chip in financially, that would be wonderful. Weddings are so expensive these days." The room erupted into applause again, as if this was the most thoughtful gift anyone could receive. People patted me on the back, saying things like, "That's so generous of you," and "Sophie is lucky to have you." I forced a smile, but inside, I was boiling. This wasn't a gift. It was a chore list disguised as a birthday present. Instead of celebrating me, they'd handed me more responsibilities and expected me to pay for it. Sophie walked over, smiling sweetly. "Thanks, Ryan," she said, her voice dripping with fake gratitude. "I knew I could count on you." I swallowed hard, keeping my emotions in check. This wasn't about me at all. It was about them. Once again, I was the afterthought, the reliable one who'd handle everything without complaint. But this time, I wasn't sure I could. I stepped out into my parents' backyard, letting the cool evening air hit my face. The laughter and chatter from the party buzzed faintly behind me, but out here, it was quiet. I sat down on the steps leading to the lawn and stared at the sky. It was a clear night, the stars faint against Denver's light pollution. I tried to focus on them, to let their stillness calm me, but my mind was racing. Inside, the party was in full swing. Mark basking in the glow of his promotion, Sophie soaking up congratulations for her engagement, my parents practically glowing with pride. And me? I was out here, alone, trying to process how what was supposed to be my birthday had turned into another event where I was just an extra in their lives. I heard the faint sound of voices drifting through the open window. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but one line caught my attention and froze me in place. "Ryan should step up," my mom was saying to someone, her tone firm. "Mark has so much on his plate, and Sophie deserves the perfect wedding. Ryan doesn't have a family of his own, so it's not like he's too busy. I just don't understand why he's being so difficult." My chest tightened as the words sank in. She wasn't defending me. She wasn't trying to understand where I was coming from. She was doubling down, justifying their expectations of me while painting me as the problem. I felt a mix of frustration, sadness, and anger boiling inside me. I'd spent years being the reliable one, the one who held everything together, and now that I was asking for even a little bit of consideration, I was the difficult one? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time I'd felt like this, but tonight, something inside me snapped. I couldn't keep doing this, not for them and not for myself. I got up from the steps and walked back inside, my expression neutral despite the storm brewing inside me. The party was loud and chaotic, people laughing and chatting like nothing was wrong. I weaved through the crowd, ignoring the quick greetings and pats on the back, and found my parents in the kitchen, talking with a group of relatives. "Hey," I said, clearing my throat. "Can we talk?" "Just the family." My mom turned to me, startled. "Right now, Ryan? Everyone's having such a good time. Can it wait?" "No," I said firmly. "It can't." The room fell quiet, and my dad exchanged a look with my mom before shrugging. "All right," he said. "Let's step into the living room." We gathered in the living room, my parents, Mark, Sophie, and me. The air was thick with tension as I stood in front of them, my heart pounding in my chest. "I want to talk about this party," I began, keeping my voice steady. "I really appreciate the effort, but this doesn't feel like a celebration for me. It feels like it's about everyone else." Sophie immediately rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "Oh, here we go." I ignored her and pressed on. "Mom, Dad, I know you meant well, but the speech is about Mark's promotion and Sophie's engagement. That wasn't what I was expecting tonight. This is supposed to be my birthday, but somehow it feels like I'm just here to cheer for them." My mom frowned, her tone defensive. "Ryan, that's not fair. We wanted to celebrate everyone. It's not all about you." I felt my frustration bubbling to the surface. But it was supposed to be. It's not like I get a party every year. This was supposed to be special. Instead, I get handed a list of wedding tasks like it's my job to make Sophie's day perfect. Sophie huffed, throwing her hands up. "Oh, come on, Ryan. You're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. We thought you'd be happy to help. You're always good at this kind of stuff." Mark chimed in, his tone condescending. "Yeah, man. It's not like you have kids or a family of your own to worry about. You've got the time." I turned to him, my voice cold. "That's the problem. You all assume I have nothing better to do just because I'm single. But my time matters, too. My life matters." "You're being dramatic," Sophie snapped. "You always make everything about you." I felt my hands clench into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Sophie, I've spent years helping this family, paying for things, organizing events, stepping in whenever someone needed something. And I've done it because I wanted to, not because I had to. But tonight? This isn't help. This is you expecting me to drop everything and be your wedding planner. If it's not that big of a deal," she shot back, "you're just being selfish." That word hit me harder than I expected. I looked at her, my voice rising slightly. "You think I'm selfish? After everything I've done for this family, you're going to call me selfish because I finally said no?" My mom stepped in, her tone placating. "Ryan, no one is saying you're selfish. We just thought you'd want to be involved. This is a family event, and you're part of the family." I shook my head, my frustration boiling over. "Mom, I've always been treated like the one who's supposed to hold everything together. But when it's about me, when I need support, I get brushed aside. This party proves that. It's not about celebrating me. It's about what I can do for everyone else." My dad, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "You're blowing this out of proportion, Ryan. The party was for everyone, not just you. Stop acting like a spoiled child. That was the final straw. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay composed. You know what? I'm done. Done with what? Sophie asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Done being the family's default helper, I said firmly. I'm not taking on your wedding tasks, Sophie. I'm not going to be your safety net anymore. From now on, I'm focusing on my life. My mom's face fell. Ryan, don't say that. We need you. No, I interrupted, my voice steady. You need me to do things for you, but you don't value me as a person. If you did, you wouldn't dismiss my feelings like this. I've given so much to this family and gotten so little in return. Mark scoffed. Oh, come on. You're acting like we've never done anything for you. I looked at him, my voice cold. Name one time. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sophie looked away, arms crossed. My parents exchanged uneasy glances. I love you all, I said, my voice softening, but I can't keep living like this. I need to step back for my own sake. With that, I turned and walked out of the room. No one followed me. For the first time in years, I felt free. Walking out of that living room felt like stepping off a stage I'd been performing on for my entire life. As I drove home that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, but there was also guilt gnawing at the edges. Was I really abandoning my family? Was I being selfish? These questions swirled in my mind, but for once, I didn't let them take over. Instead, I focused on one thought. I had done the right thing for myself. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years. The family group chat, however, was buzzing. Sophie had already fired off a string of messages, starting with, Ryan ruined the party last night. She followed it up with her usual dramatics, claiming I was turning my back on the family and on her big moment. Mark chimed in shortly after, adding his signature condescending tone. Seriously, Ryan? That was immature. You need to grow up and stop making everything about you. I stared at the messages for a while, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to respond, to defend myself, to list every sacrifice I'd made for them over the years. But I knew it wouldn't matter. They didn't want to understand. They wanted me to fall back in line. With a sigh, I muted the group chat and set my phone aside. That day, for the first time in a long time, I focused entirely on myself. I went for a run, something I hadn't done in weeks. I stopped by a local coffee shop and spent hours working on a photography project I'd neglected for months. It felt good to reconnect with parts of myself that I'd pushed aside to make room for everyone else's needs. Over the next few weeks, I started building a life that felt like mine again. I signed up for a photography class I'd always wanted to take. I joined a local trivia group that met on Wednesday nights. I even started hiking on weekends, exploring trails outside of Denver that I'd only ever heard about. These small changes made me realize just how much energy my family had drained from me over the years. Of course, the guilt trips didn't stop. My mom called a few days after the party, her voice heavy with disappointment. Ryan, I don't understand what's gotten into you, she said. Why are you being so difficult? Your sister needs you right now. Mom, I said, keeping my tone steady, I've been there for Sophie, and for all of you. More times than I can count. But I need to start setting boundaries. I can't keep sacrificing my time and energy for everyone else. She sighed, and I could picture her shaking her head on the other end of the line. But we're family, Ryan. Family supports each other. That's a two-way street, Mom, I said. And I don't feel like I've been supported in return. I'm not saying I don't love you or that I don't care. I'm saying I need to take care of myself, too. She didn't have much to say after that. We hung up, and for a while, the calls stopped. But Sophie found other ways to make her feelings known. A mutual friend told me Sophie had been complaining to anyone who would listen about how selfish I was being. Apparently, her wedding planning was hitting major snags, and without me to step in, things weren't going smoothly. Meanwhile, Mark stayed true to form. He was too busy with work to get involved in the family drama, but that didn't stop him from taking occasional potshots at me in the group chat. Hope you're enjoying all your free time, Ryan, he wrote once, followed by a winking emoji. I didn't bother replying. For the first time, I wasn't letting their opinions control me. I wasn't dropping everything to fix their problems. And while it wasn't easy, it was freeing. I started reconnecting with friends, people I hadn't seen much of because I was always too busy dealing with family obligations. Jake, my best friend since college, was the first to call me out. "Man, where have you been?" he asked one Saturday morning as we grabbed coffee. "You used to be the guy organizing game nights. Now you're like a ghost." I laughed, a little embarrassed. "You know how it is, family stuff." He raised an eyebrow. "Family stuff? Are you being their unpaid assistant?" His words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. "Maybe a little of both," I said with a shrug. "Well, good for you if you're finally drawing some lines," Jake said. "You deserve to have your own life, Ryan." Hearing that was like a breath of fresh air. For so long, I'd been caught in this cycle of putting everyone else first. It was exhausting, but it felt normal, like that was just how things were supposed to be. Now, I was starting to realize that it didn't have to be that way. Meanwhile, the cracks in my family's dynamic were starting to show. Without me to step in, tensions between Sophie and my parents began to escalate. A mutual friend told me that Sophie had gotten into a massive argument with my mom about the wedding guest list. My dad, true to his usual form, stayed on the sidelines, claiming he was too busy to get involved. I felt a twinge of guilt when I heard about the chaos, but I reminded myself it wasn't my responsibility to fix it. They'd spent years relying on me to keep the peace, and now they were finally seeing what happened when I wasn't there to do it. One evening, my mom called again. This time, she didn't try to guilt me, at least not directly. Instead, she gave me a detailed rundown of all the ways Sophie's wedding planning was falling apart. I could tell she was hoping I'd offer to step in, but I didn't take the bait. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mom," I said. "I hope it works out." There was a long pause before she replied. "You really won't help, will you?" "No," I said firmly. "I won't." She sighed, and I could hear the disappointment in her voice. But for the first time, I didn't feel compelled to fix it. The more time I spent focusing on myself, the more I realized how much I'd been neglecting. I wasn't just reclaiming my independence. I was rediscovering parts of myself that I'd almost forgotten. For years, I'd been so caught up in being the dependable one, the fixer, that I'd lost sight of who I was outside of my family. Now, I was starting to figure that out again. And honestly, it felt incredible. When my 33rd birthday rolled around, I decided to keep things simple. No big parties, no drama, no family obligations. Just a quiet dinner with a few close friends at a cozy restaurant downtown. It wasn't extravagant, but it was exactly what I wanted. We sat around a small wooden table, the kind that wobbles slightly when you lean on it, sharing stories and laughing over good food. My best friend Jake raised his glass midway through the meal, grinning from ear to ear. "To Ryan," he said, looking right at me, "for finally living his best life." Everyone laughed and clinked their glasses together. Jake's toast might have been half joking, but it hit me deeply. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself instead of bending over backward to meet someone else's expectations. After dinner, we walked around downtown, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement from an earlier rain. I soaked in the moment, letting myself feel the freedom I'd worked so hard to reclaim. That night, when I got home, I sat on the couch with a slice of leftover cake, staring out the window at the Denver skyline. The city buzzed quietly in the distance, but my apartment felt peaceful. I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. The fights, the boundaries I'd set, the life I was slowly building for myself. I missed the idea of a close-knit family, the kind you see in movies or hear about from friends. But I'd come to accept that my family wasn't like that, and that was okay. I didn't need to keep sacrificing myself to earn their approval or love. In the months after I walked out of that birthday party, things had shifted, both in my family and in me. Sophie's wedding went ahead without my involvement, though I heard from a mutual friend that it was a chaotic affair. My parents helped as much as they could, but without me to step in and take over, there were plenty of missteps along the way. Sophie didn't invite me to the wedding, just as she'd threatened. At first, it stung more than I wanted to admit. But on the day of her wedding, as I hiked through a quiet trail outside the city, I realized I didn't feel sad about missing it. For once, I wasn't tied up in their chaos. I was free. Mark stayed distant, throwing the occasional passive-aggressive comment into the group chat, but I didn't engage. My dad mostly stayed silent, as he always had, while my mom made a few attempts to guilt me back into the fold. "Ryan, things just aren't the same without you," she said once, her tone heavy with regret. "They're not supposed to be, Mom," I replied gently. "I'm not saying I don't love you all, but I can't be everything for everyone anymore." Eventually, even her calls became less frequent. They weren't cutting me off, but I could tell they were trying to figure out how to navigate this new version of me. One with boundaries, one who didn't automatically drop everything to help. I had wondered if my absence would force them to grow, to take on some of the responsibility I'd shouldered for years. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but I'd stopped feeling responsible for fixing them, and that was enough. I spent the rest of my 33rd birthday in quiet reflection. The next morning, I woke up to find a few text messages from my family. Sophie had written, "Happy birthday, Ryan," with no additional sentiment. Mark's message was even shorter. "Hope it's a good one." My mom's text was more personal. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. I hope you have a wonderful day. We miss you." I stared at her message for a long moment before typing out a reply. "Thanks, Mom. I miss you too." It was true. I did miss her, and in some ways, I missed all of them. But I didn't miss the dynamic that had existed between us. I didn't miss the feeling of being used, of being taken for granted. Later that week, I hung a framed photo in my apartment. It was one I'd taken during a recent hike, a wide shot of a sunrise breaking over the mountains. The golden light spilled across the peaks, the colors vivid and alive. It was one of my best shots, and it reminded me of the person I was becoming. Someone who valued himself, who prioritized his own happiness. I knew I still had a long way to go. Boundaries are hard to set, but even harder to maintain. There would be more calls, more guilt trips, more moments where I'd have to remind myself why I'd taken this path in the first place. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was on the right track. As I sat on my balcony that evening, watching the sun dip below the city skyline, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't settle for being treated like an afterthought again. I wouldn't let guilt pull me back into the cycle of self-sacrifice. I deserved better than that, and from now on, I would make sure I got it. For the first time, I felt at peace. And that, I realized, was the best gift I could have given myself.